Hi, how are you? On my deck tonight. Can't decide if it's hot or cold. It's certainly up there in the upper 80s. A few days back, I read a chapter from a book, and I want to read one more from a different book um, to see if you can relate to this in any way. It was an experience in my life, and I think maybe it speaks to a lot of people, or for a lot of people. The book is from a book called Stories of Recovering Fundamentalists. The subtitle is Understanding and Responding to Christian Absolutism. If you want it, you could probably just type in on Amazon Stories of Recovering Fundamentalists with my name. It's been around for a while, so I'm sure there's plenty of these copies out there. And also, I don't think it's much on Kindle, but I want to read the introduction to this book and see how maybe it just might relate to you. I was once a Christian absolutist. Sometimes on hard and lonely days, I still feel the pull of certainty. You may wonder what I mean by the term Christian absolutist. Some might use the term fundamentalist. I really don't like that term because it carries with it quite a bit of baggage. Words evoke meanings and thoughts. I think Americans have many feelings when it comes to the word fundamentalist, some of them pent up anger. Those so identified as fundamentalists in the Christian world once wore this label with a kind of militant pride at times. Excuse me. Actually, the word has been through several incarnations in American history. It's a fairly recent usage. In the sense of used here, since the sense used here, it derives from a 12-volume work commissioned in 1909 to combat the emerging voices of theological modernism. Its composers included a wide range of writers, including some who came from denominations now recognized as fundamentalists, or maybe some would say evangelical. The works, The Fundamentals, was a battle cry, a throwing down of the gauntlet in the face of higher criticism and modern scholarship. Still, in many circles, the work went largely unnoticed. The name fundamentalist grew to be associated with many churches in the early 20th century. Many were of the holiness tradition. It would be safe to say that few of these early fundamentalists have much direct knowledge of the original literature that lent its name to the movement. Fundamentalism came to national attention largely through the Scopes Monkey trial, excuse me again, which took place on July 10 through 1925, in Dayton, Tennessee. The trial dealt with the teachings of evolution in Tennessee schools, which was illegal at the time. John Scopes, a substitute teacher, was charged with violating the Butler Act. Prosecutor William Jennings Bryan was a nationally known politician, local hero, and very prominent fundamentalist. The trial made national headlines, but largely through Bryan's own testimony. He ended up being on the witness chair himself. The nation arrived at a view that fundamentalists were ignorant, intolerant, and fanatical. Fundamentalists more or less went into seclusion, avoiding contamination from the world as much as possible. Well, several decades passed, and then the rehabilitation of the title took place. It came about through emerging involvement of fundamentalists in politics, beginning in earnest in the 1970s. To them, the world was going to hell in a handbasket, and the time was ripe to begin to push for godly men in positions of power. The term became a badge of honor for some, a source of irritation to many, part of a political strategy for more than a few, and the sound of political careers ending for yet others. And then came September 11, 2001, and the name acquired a different connotation. Now when some hear it, They think of planes flying into the World Trade Center on that fateful September day. Many folks associate the word fundamentalist with that event and pair it with the word Islamic. They see fundamentalism as something dealing with them and not us. Of course, if one really thinks about it, she or he will soon recognize this is a misnomer. We face an equally extreme Christian or quasi-Christian variety of fundamentalism, every bit as crazy as the Islamic variety. All we must do to see the truth of this statement is activate which was in recent memory. Remember the Branch Davidians, recall the shootings or attempted shootings and bombings of abortion clinics and doctors. Remember the protests against gays carried out at the funeral of dead soldiers. The problem with many Americans is that they will readily see the danger in the other guy's absolutism, but are slow to recognize it in their own. Fundamentalism carries with it the connotation of violence and hate-mongering, and no one wants to own that. In addition, to be perfectly honest, I'm not at all sure it applies to most varieties of American fundamentalism. As William James so long ago pointed out, there are many varieties of religious experiences, and fundamentalism is one. I'm leery of using the word fundamentalist as one point on the spectrum of Christian literalism to describe the common varieties of absolute truth claims we encounter day to day among our friends and neighbors. There's another side to fundamentalism I prefer to call absolutism. Many of the comments referred to in this book refer to fundamentalism, and that's because in the minds of most researchers, the absolutist belief side of fundamentalism is no different from the fundamentalist side, from the violent, approving, militant side. That's why I prefer the word absolutist. However, faithfulness to the language of many sources used will necessitate using the terms interchangeably. So what do I mean by absolutism? Is the term absolutism referring to anything particular, or does it refer to fundamentalists? I refer to a belief that certain individuals possess absolute, undeniable, indisputable truth. That truth is a court from which there is no appeal. It knows with absolute certainty. Of course, technically speaking, absolutism is definitely part of the larger phenomenon of fundamentalism. In fact, it arguably forms the more brazen acts of fundamentalism. This conclusion seems inescapable. That being said, I return to my earlier statement. I was a Christian absolutist. As a child, my parents made very little provision for our religious training. We did not go to church. I tended to be unhappy. I was overweight, not very sharp academically, had many irritating mannerisms. I had Tourette syndrome. And when I wrote this book, I was 51. I'm now 65. But I had Tourette syndrome and many jerks and tics in school, and I received much criticism for that. My diagnosis in my 20s was as if a miracle had occurred in my life. The medications all but cured me, at least if you didn't mind the rather annoying and frightening side effects. However, as a kid, no one knew anything about Tourette syndrome. I was just the fat kid that made funny noises and jerked his head. Being the poorest child in my class did not help much either. My parents tried, they really did, but life seemed to have kicked them, especially Dad, in the teeth. We just could not seem to make any headway. Mom stayed home, and Dad seemed to go from dead-end job to dead-end job until his physical disabilities finally got the best of him. A woman in our neighborhood ran a children's Bible club associated with Child Evangelism Fellowship. Going to Bible club was the high point of my week. We heard Bible stories, sang songs, played games, and did crafts. However, there was a darker side to Bible club as well, a part that terrified me and gave me bad dreams at night. Each week I endured the evangelistic appeal with all the hellfire and brimstone the Bible club lady could muster, and she could muster plenty. As time went on, I found myself more and more in need of friendship and acceptance from the Bible club lady and began to go to his church. The message was simple enough, though I think even as a child it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. God loved me, I had sinned, I made God very angry. Because of my sin, God was going to burn me up in hell forever. But wait, God still loved me. Yet God had made up these rules, and the rules said I had to pay an eternal hell for every little wrong I was guilty. What could God do? Those were the rules. God thought about it and decided that God's son Jesus would take care of things. He'd come down to earth, never sin, die and suffer hell for me. He'd take the rap, and I'd get off scot-free. And I knew this was true, the Bible club lady told me, because she could show me the verses in the Bible, and God never lied. As I stated, the story sounded kind of convoluted, even to my little 9-year-old mind, but I was so scared to go into hell, I worked at it until it began to make sense to me some way. Later, my thoughts about the system I grew up with as a child were to change as the message became increasingly untenable and old doubts returned. I've written about this in some articles I've written. Nevertheless, as a child, all I could see was a way out of eternal hell. The Bible club lady made an altar call one day. I went up to get saved. Just believe was all she said. Then the Bible club lady took me to her church, and I grew up in the poor part of Kansas City, and the church was definitely in the high-rent district. What a changing community. It was a regular Baptist church, GARB, General Association of Regular Baptists. In those days, they readily and proudly identified themselves as fundamentalists. I can't say about them nowadays, and they lived up to it. They especially emphasized eternal damnation and the absolute inerrancy of the Bible. From Genesis to Revelation, it was all true. When I hit my teen years, I found out this didn't quite make so much sense to me. I felt square and out of touch. The hippie movement was just making its scene in Kansas City, and that appealed to me. And around age 13, I began to experiment with that lifestyle. And as I grew older, I got more and more involved with it, and I quit the entire church scene. Anyway, if they happened to be right, I was saved after all. She said you could never lose it. It seemed to me as if I was a winner either way. Then I began quitting school. In 9th grade, I only attended 47 days. At age 15, I had a terrible argument with my father, and he threw me out of the house, and I began to live with friends and panhandling. You might feel it was a sad situation, but to me it was great. I could live the proverbial hippie lifestyle. But I discovered absolutism dies a difficult death. Almost as soon as I met the hippies, I met the ex-hippie Jesus freaks, and something began to call me back. Now, they were every bit as absolutist as the Bible club lady was and the Baptist church was, but they were more free-spirited and countercultural. And over the years, I began to sense that I had found my way back home, yet I did not have to go back to the old square ways I had rejected. They were lighter on the hell business and heavier on the Jesus loves you stuff. And this led me to my second conversion. And I moved into a Christian commune right around the time I was 16. Now my days consisted of street witnessing, going out, passing out Bibles, doing Bible reading. As the leaders explained the Bible to me, I found fewer and fewer objections. By the power of pure choice, I became an absolutist. The Bible was right from cover to cover, and I was sure I had an inside track in understanding it. And the Jesus freaks did help. They got me back in school, for which I am eternally grateful. They helped me grow up. They saw to it that I got a job. And they sent me off to do the Lord's work with their blessing. A long story, but somehow I ended up in college, and little did I know it. But before all was said and done, I would have a graduate degree in theology, one in psychology, one in teacher education, and a PhD, and become a college professor. Yes, I owe them more than I could ever repay. As time went on, I became more earnest in my absolutism, and I met Irene, fellow absolutist, albeit a much gentler one, at the college. We were both elementary education majors back then. And we married in 1977 and remained happily married today. At this point, it was 30 years. Now it's 46. After our marriage came teaching jobs and babies. Our first house, after leaving the Jesus freaks, came along, and why did we leave? I had to ask myself. And Irene was not much for it. After all, we heard repeatedly that we had it all together. And nonetheless, for some reason, my early teens on, I had a strong attraction to pacifism. And the moral majority was something that had captured the Jesus Freak Church. And Irene might not have otherwise left, except the Jesus Freak elders reminded her in weekly sermons to be obedient to her husband. It's a long story, but in 1980 we ended up in a Mennonite church, and Irene loved it. The heavy yoke of male authority was now gone, and she could grow in new ways, and we discovered here questions were allowed and even encouraged. The first question I asked myself was about the story the Bible Club lady told me that always troubled me. I began to wonder about the whole hellfire deal. Of course, almost all the parts the Bible Club lady told me I found troubling. There had to be another way of looking at things, and I thought long and hard over it. And beginning in earnest, when I was in my first pastorate in 1985, I finally came to terms with it, and some years later I wrote an article about it. And little by little I began to view the entire nature of eternal perdition in a completely new way. Anyway, one day, back at the Mennonite church, I was discussing the Bible with our assistant pastor, a guy about my age, a young fellow. And he said to me, I just can't believe every word of it's true. And I thought for a minute. Neither do I replied. I half expected lightning might come out of the sky and strike me. Strangely, though it had always given me a sense of stability, I realized at that moment I was not an absolutist. I felt light, and I realized at that moment that I was soaring above new heights of freedom. Somehow, though, I felt uprooted. It seemed as if I was back in elementary school. I had betrayed a sacred trust. And again, I felt alone and scared. And friend, you may be at this place too, feeling alone and scared. Hang in there. The Master said it himself, seek and you shall find. Have a great day.